Welcome to the IISS this morning. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today, Ahmed Rashid. Ahmed is the best known Pakistani author on Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Central Asia, and we're delighted to have him back with us at the IISS. Ahmed will be speaking today on Pakistan on the Brink, which also happens to be the title of his latest book, with the subtitle of The Future of Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the West.
Well, thank you very much. It's lovely to be back again. I nearly lost my notebook in the taxi, but thank God it was retrieved. I'll try and I'm going to divide the time between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Let me start with Afghanistan. I've been in Washington and New York and meeting with officials, and I'll try and give you a sense of how I see things going. Obviously, the news has been very miserable. Yesterday, what happened both in Pakistan and in Afghanistan. Let me first of all say that on Afghanistan, I think I divide the problems of Afghanistan into three areas of crisis. All of them in deep crisis. The first is the international arena, which is the question of withdrawal. The French are moving out, other Europeans may move out, but even more than that, I think the real international crisis is going to come about whether Europe and the United States are actually going to be able to sustain the Afghan economy and army for another 5 to 10 years, and whether that money is going to be available given all the recession and the problems that we face in the West. I mean, if Spain goes under in the next few weeks, I can't imagine the Europeans really coming forward with major funding for the Afghan army, etc. And that will, certainly prompt a crisis at home. I fear very much that the Chicago summit is not going to be able to give any definite answers, the NATO summit in Chicago, to any of these international problems. The second part is the strategic compacts that are being signed between the Afghan government and foreigners. It's very unclear, given the kind of military situation right now, as to whether these foreign troops are going to be there in 2014 to continue for another 5 years. We should remember what happened in Iraq. There was the pledge of Americans staying on in Iraq. The Americans were asked to leave. Now, the strategic compact with the United States, once it's signed, it's not clear what the neighbors' attitudes are going to be. As far as we know now, all the neighbors are hostile to a strategic compact between the United States and U.S. Special Forces staying on for the next 5 years. And when I say all the neighbors, Afghanistan has 6 neighbors, most critically Iran and Pakistan. Both are not in favor of this. And the Central Asians, the Russians, Putin is doing NATO a big favor by providing an exit for American troops. Whether Putin actually wants American troops to stay on another 5 years is a big question. And China, of course, looks on a long-term presence of American forces in northern Afghanistan as being, very suspicious. So the strategic compact is certainly part of U.S. military strategy, but whether it will actually be implemented and carried through is another question. I think the regional issue, President Obama came in with this whole idea that there would be a regional compact, that there would be an agreement of non-interference in Afghanistan. It's something the Afghans need very badly because of their experiences in the 90s with the interference that took place by all the neighboring states. They not only want a regional agreement between the immediate neighbors and what I call the near neighbors, India, Saudi Arabia, and Russia. But they want some mechanism by which they can actually lodge their complaints about interference. And this is the big stumbling block, because it is, the natural thing would be for an agreement which is endorsed by the United Nations, by the Security Council, and that the UN sets up some mechanism whereby the Afghans can actually register a complaint about interference in the future. And most states are probably going to be opposed to anything like that, given, I can well imagine Russia, China, Pakistan unwilling to give that kind of power to the UN Security Council. So, and actually, if we look at the regional situation is much worse now than when Obama took in. He had put Holbrooke on this, doing the diplomatic rounds. We don't have that kind of diplomatic push from the United States anymore. Relations with Iran are completely down the tubes. There's no sign that the Americans can possibly discuss Afghanistan with the Iranians unless the nuclear thing is endorsed. With Pakistan, we've seen the last 5 months there's been no relationship with the United States. I hope now that it will restart. Again, raising this issue of interference right now with relations so sensitive as they are between Pakistan and the US is going to be very difficult. So since Obama has come in, I mean, he has overseen, if you like, a very marked deterioration with all the neighboring states and the possibility of cooperation between Afghanistan and the neighboring states. And the third factor is the domestic cycle of crisis. I'll just list them very quickly. I'm not going to go into grave detail. A deepening of the ethnic divide in Afghanistan, the non-Pashtuns unwilling to go ahead with talks with the Taliban, which the Karzai government and the Americans are very keen on, and a clear sort of north-south division once again emerging between the Pashtuns and the non-Pashtuns. Secondly, a very deep and dire economic crisis in Afghanistan because in 10 years, the West has completely failed, in my opinion, to build an indigenous economy in Afghanistan, which is self-sustaining. And tens of thousands of Afghans who work for foreign troops will be rendered jobless. And these are the very Afghans who, in the last 10 years, have, this is the new generation of Afghans who benefited most from the Western presence. They're educated, they speak English, they're trained in various skills, etc. And this is the very, they believe in democracy, they're pro-Western, etc. And these are the very people who would help build the new Afghanistan. And frankly, they're not going to have jobs. There's been very little investment in key areas like agriculture, which could have provided a lot of mass jobs to Afghanistan, for Afghanistan. And don't forget that there's now a major conference coming up being held by the United Nations Refugee Agency regarding the return of 2 million Afghan refugees in Pakistan, another 2 million in Iran, whether these refugees are actually going to be able to come back to a state of war and also to a state of very rapid economic crisis. And of course, the economic crisis is going to be made worse if the West is not going to be able to come up with the money. So the economic thing I see as being absolutely critical. Finally, the elections in 2014, I was very encouraged by Karzai's talk of bringing the elections forward by 1 year. I've been advocating that for the last 6 months, saying you cannot have both the withdrawal and the elections in the same year. You've got to choose between what you want. And it would be much better if elections could be held by 2013. There would be a new face, a new cabinet, perhaps a new vision, a new inspiration. There's a lot of disillusionment with Karzai internally, and certainly, and by him stepping down, say a year before the withdrawal, it would certainly help things a lot. And finally, we have the whole role of the various militaries in Afghanistan. You not only have an army which is going to be made up to 350,000 and then, according to NATO, is going to be wound down within a year, depending on what the Taliban do, to 220,000, army and police, that is. But you have all these extra paramilitary outfits that were set up by General Petraeus and McChrystal, the police, the local village militias, and all the rest of it. These were really and remain a result of American largesse. I mean, if that money goes, these militias become criminal gangs, recruits for warlords, recruits for drug smugglers. It's a very dangerous position, I think, to be in. And there's no plan for drawing down these forces and reintegration and reintegrating these forces with skills, etc., to work and bringing them down. So I see these as a great threat. Warlordism remains a great threat. There's no doubt that the North is arming itself. I don't see anyone wanting a civil war in Afghanistan. I think people are exhausted and tired, but at the same time, there will be enormous pressures put on because of the talks with the Taliban, because of all these armed factions that are there in Afghanistan. And these, of course, pose immense problems for the neighbors, especially Pakistan and Iran, who are deeply worried not only at the size of the Afghan army. General Kiani has frequently made this point about this Afghan army, which could be far larger than what is needed for Afghanistan. But more than that, I think, are these paramilitary forces, and we don't know which way they will go. I think, finally, we should understand that, when you build an army, the Soviets built I was in Afghanistan throughout the Soviet occupation. The Afghan army collapsed 3 times in 10 years of the Soviet occupation. And each time it was rebuilt. And it was rebuilt on the basis of a Pashtun officer corps that was extremely pro-communist, very well trained, very motivated, and very organized. And most of them came from eastern Afghanistan. And what this army completely lacks is, first of all, that very same Pashtun officer corps. The officer corps is largely Tajik, which creates huge problems when they go south and try and take up the fight with the Taliban. And there is a huge disproportion in the recruitment, because you're not getting Pashtuns recruited into the army either as soldiers or as officers. And if there are Pashtuns, they're with all due respect, they're the wrong kind of Pashtuns. They're not Pashtuns from these traditional areas of Pashtun recruitment, eastern Afghanistan and parts of southern Afghanistan. They are Pashtuns from other parts of Afghanistan. So this disproportion in the army is going to have consequences. And secondly is a question of motivation and inspiration. Who is this Afghan army going to be loyal to? Is it going to be loyal to the president? Is it going to be loyal to their various commanders? And do the officers have enough clout there to make them loyal to themselves? Are they going to be loyal to the state, to democracy, all these vague sort of terms? I think all that is really very uncertain. Afghanistan has a very sharp and keen national identity, which has prevented anyone from trying to split it apart or separate it along ethnic lines or anything else. But an army needs some vision and motivation and inspiration. And to my mind, that has been really lacking. Karzai has not shown much interest in the building of this army. He has not motivated these army, the army's loyalty to the president, to the state, to democracy, etc., etc. So I think that's a key area. And finally, I think this is the talks with the Taliban. I'm happy to answer questions on that. I find it very depressing that these talks are not going well. There is still an acute division in the Obama administration over these talks between the Defense Department and other areas of government. And as you know, the talks have been suspended for the time being between the Taliban and the Americans over this prisoner exchange issue and the opening of an office in Qatar. It doesn't seem that now, with the elections coming up, unfortunately, the election timetable is going to drive these talks, and these talks are really, I don't see them moving much forward, certainly before November. The main thrust of my book, frankly, is on Pakistan. I think Pakistan is in a very deep and serious crisis of a huge magnitude, which includes economic, social, political. And essentially, I try and trace, why are we in the mess that we are in? And essentially, the real failure of the military and political elite has been its failure to carry out reform after the end of the Cold War. After 1989, we continued acting as though nothing had happened. except that the whole world had changed. And other countries were rapidly carrying out, even the former Soviet Union, rapidly carrying out economic reforms, social reforms, none of which we did. We sponsored extremist groups as part of the military's foreign policy. That was allowable under the Cold War because the Americans were doing exactly the same thing and encouraging that to happen, as we saw in Afghanistan with the Mujahideen and the CIA money coming to. But after the Cold War, and certainly after 9/11, the idea that militant groups could carry on, whether they were going to be fighting in Kashmir or whether they were going to be fighting in Afghanistan, these militant groups could continue to enjoy sanctuary in Pakistan, be supported by the Pakistani authorities, that in itself was now something that was completely unacceptable to the neighbors, to the region, and to the world. And really, unfortunately, right after the Soviets left Afghanistan, there was the uprising in Kashmir with a lot of Punjabi groups going into Kashmir. That was followed in the late 90s by Pakistan's support for the Taliban, tens of thousands of Pakistanis going to fight for the Taliban in Afghanistan against the Northern Alliance. And then we had the 9/11, the turnaround of Pakistan's policy, but once again in 2003, the revival of the Taliban, and again, thousands of Pakistanis going to fight for the Taliban against US forces. And now, of course, we have the ghastly phenomenon of Pakistani Taliban, whom the army is now fighting and taking very high casualties. And we've seen right now that the intense fighting in the last 3 months, despite America having stopped all aid, you now have something like 180,000 refugees who have fled the tribal areas to Peshawar just in the last couple of months because of the intensity of the fighting between the army and the Pakistani Taliban. But again, the difference, the nature of how Pakistan treats the Afghan Taliban and how Pakistan treats those Pakistani Taliban who are opposed to the state. There are also Pakistani Taliban who are not opposed to the state, and they are left on their own, as it were. This dichotomy, in my opinion, is really undermining the fabric of the country. And I don't see how these policies can continue for very long. So the core issue, to my mind, is a national security strategy and a foreign policy which serves the nation and the people, rather than serving aims and ambitions outside the territory of Pakistan. And that has been, I think, the problem since the Cold War. We have not been able to alter our national strategic framework and the way we conduct foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. I mean, other countries have foreign policies which strengthen economic development, social progress. They make friends with neighboring countries and trade pacts, etc. And foreign policy is a result of a domestic vision. In Pakistan, it's been the opposite. Pakistan's foreign policy has undermined the state itself. It has created even more disturbances and splits in the ethnic makeup of the country. It has divided the country. It has created this whole phenomenon of the Pakistani Taliban. And unless the military, the intelligence services, the political elite is able to grasp this and turn this around, certainly this can't be turned around in a day or two, but I think the intention should be there. We still have no national plan for reconciling with a lot of these groups from Punjab who have been fighting in Kashmir, for example. I mean, this very stupid move by the Americans regarding Hafiz Saeed of Lashkar-e-Taiba. I mean, he's now suddenly become overnight. He was lying low for 4 years after Mumbai, and he's suddenly become a national hero because the Americans have gone and placed, a 10 million bounty on his head. I mean, the Americans admit that was a very stupid move on their part. And I don't think they even were even able to see what consequences this would have internally in Pakistan. But the fact of the matter is that, Lashkar and multiple groups like this are still very active. They're active not only vis-a-vis India, but they're also active vis-a-vis Afghanistan and Central Asia and other places. So now, certainly I'm not advocating that military action is needed. What I'm saying is that a new vision and a new future is needed to bring these people into the political process, to re-educate them, re-ideologize them, if you like, give them new skills so they could be useful to society. And we need a program that goes about this. Secondly, the economy is in a dire situation. This is also a result of the failure. Globalization passed us by. High tech passed us by. We have not been able to constitute a single new industry in this country for the last 30 years. We're still dependent, 60% of our exports are still dependent on textiles. Textiles was something we were producing in the 50s. We don't have any major new industry. Agriculture has been hugely neglected, which could be a huge earner. So the economy remains dire, and the fact is that with this present tension, not only has U.S. military aid stopped, if you read the papers the other day, U.S. economic aid has been slashed in half. The Canadians have slashed their aid. It's likely that the Europeans might do the same. And unless there is seen to be unless the leadership in Pakistan shows a vision for the future, which is not based on what we've had so far. Lastly, there are other problems. There's the insurgency in Baluchistan. Unfortunately, the military has viewed Baluchistan as a sort of an appendage of India throughout. The Baloch have had 5 insurgencies. They have genuine grievances against the state. All their figures of health, education, economic development are by far the lowest in the country. They have genuine grievances which have to be addressed. Now, obviously, India, just as Pakistan has fished in troubled waters in India, whether it was Kashmir or Punjab or Assam or anywhere else, so the Indians will fish in troubled waters in Pakistan. But the real issue is a political solution for Baluchistan. It's not, we just had General Musharraf saying, well, the army, has to deal with Baluchistan. It's not the army that has to deal with Baluchistan. It's the political leadership that has to deal with Baluchistan. And to be able to come up with a sound political solution with some genuine sharing of resources, which the army has to back. It can't be done without backing of the military. And this perception that the whole Baluchistan crisis is an India-caused crisis, I think is very wrong, is very detrimental, and is going to make things much, much worse. I hope one of the spin-offs of the American withdrawal from Afghanistan and the talks with the Taliban, which I hope will continue, I hope one of the spin-offs will be a reduction in the activities of the Pakistani Taliban inside Pakistan, and I hope that it will lead to a peace settlement in Baluchistan as well, and that Pakistan, the essence right now of Pakistan, should be to focus internally. We should give up this state of denial that we're in about almost every facet of our foreign policy. We should focus internally on rebuilding the country, which desperately needs to be done and is at least a 10-year venture. We should cease foreign adventurism and trying to define national security by deploying forces outside Pakistan rather than focusing on the internal situation inside Pakistan. And finally, we need the continuation of democracy. I think right now we have a very weak, inept, corrupt democracy. I don't, pull my punches when I talk about, the present government. But at the same time, it must be said that there is no cure except for more democracy. We can only hope that the elections will take place on time, possibly brought forward to 2013. I hope that the next government will be better, slightly cleaner, more efficient than the last government. And I hope that such a process continues. But the key to this is that the military intervention is really no answer. Every military dictatorship that we've had has ended in a cul-de-sac. There has been no exit for a military leadership. They've either been killed or they've been overthrown through a mass movement, as Musharraf was. And I think the military has learned its lesson, that military intervention is no solution to the country. But that means that the politicians have to step up to the podium. So far, are the politicians performing? But there is no doubt that democracy is the only panacea, and we need more democracy, not less. And we need a more open society and more discussion about national security issues and foreign policy issues. These issues cannot just be in the realm of the military and the intelligence services. They have to also be part of the discussion in civil society and the political parties. I just want to read you one sentence, of the last sentence in my book. For too long, the military and civil elite have neglected their one single task, which is to make life better for their own people. Unfortunately, both elements of the state have feathered their nests, largely at the expense of the public and the people. Pakistan is now reaching 200 million people. We're 6th or 7th largest country in the world. We clearly cannot go along the same path. The lack of reform, the lack of change, the unwillingness to give a new vision to the people that we have done so far. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. Lots to think about, and I'm sure we'll have a fascinating discussion. Let me start by asking you, on the basis of the title of the talk, Pakistan on the Brink. Essentially, we've seen, as you've described very well, the difficulties in Pakistan domestically in terms of regional politics, its relationships with other countries. But Pakistan has gone through difficult times in the past, in fact, even more difficult times, the last 3 or 4 decades. There is still a certain amount of resilience that we see within Pakistan. We have there's a democratic setup that could near its full term for the first time in several decades, though it's not an entirely perfect democracy. But my question really is when you talk about Pakistan on the brink of what? I mean, is it a brink of, you've talked about increased chaos in the past, or crisis, or concerns over undermining the social fabric of society, but where do you see Pakistan on the brink of?
Well, first of all, I agree with you. I think there's a lot of positive things which I also write about in my book, which deal with the whole youth movement, the civil society movement. There's enormous discussion in Pakistan. The young people especially want change. They want economic reforms, which this government has been unable to do. They want an end to all this series of conflicts in Afghanistan and the Taliban. And I think young people, I think the country has become averse to military coups and military rule. I think that's something that the military has understood very well, that military coups and military rule are no longer acceptable. Remember that the last 4 coups we had, 90% of the people basically supported them. I think if there were, God forbid, if there's a military coup today, I think half the country would oppose it. And I think that's a result of this new awareness that has come about and is a very positive feature. What, unfortunately, you're not getting is young, educated technocrats, going into service. The idea of service through government, through the civil service, through economic development, etc., is still a concept that is very far away in Pakistan. And basically, it's far away because of the corruption of the system. For example, if you look at the political parties today, none of the political parties can boast of an economist. They can't boast of any technocrats, young technocrats who've joined these political parties in the last 5 or 10 years. Now, one reason for that is you had a military ruler for 10 years who sent the leaders off into exile, who didn't allow any political activity to take place, or only a subscribed political activity. So you need to open up the political field and give young people the opportunity to serve the nation. You don't get young people going into politics. Now, as far as the brink is concerned, what I'm talking about here is if we continue down this path, We are, I mean, I don't consider us a failed state. We have functioning institutions which are, you know, we have an army, we have a bureaucracy, we have a judicial system. These are not the signs of a failed state. But we are certainly going into a very anarchic kind of situation. I would say there were 10 to 15% of the territory of Pakistan is no longer governed by anyone. Parts of Baluchistan, parts of Sindh, parts of the tribal areas. We have these insurgencies going on inside the country, which, you know, people can't seem to get a grip on. I mean, we have this jailbreak yesterday, which is the most extraordinary thing that, you know, that has happened so far. And all these are, and then the economic crisis, which, you know, an energy crisis. There's no electricity. I mean, in Lahore, I haven't had gas for 6 months. You know, there's no energy in the major cities for up to 16 hours a day. Now, all these are, you know, indicators of things that have really gone wrong and need to be corrected.
Excellent. Well, the floor is open for questions or comments, discussion. Yes, if you could identify yourself, that would be great. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Julian Borgia from The Guardian. I wanted to ask you about the talks with Taliban and the Qatar process. If you could go into more detail about your view on what brought it to a halt. The Taliban statement said something about unrealistic demands, and whether you think there's any chance of anything happening with Guantanamo to get things going again.
You know, to be frank, it has been the delays on the American side that have brought these talks to a halt. The Taliban have been incredibly patient. They did not break off the talks when, you know, all these terrible incidents occurred, when the urination on the soldiers and the killing of the 16 people and the burning of the Qurans and all that. They didn't call off. They have called off the talks, saying specifically that the US has delayed the first confidence-building measure. Now, this confidence-building measure was based on two things: opening an office in Qatar, which was a very good idea because it would expose the Taliban to Afghan society, which was, you know, badly needed, and to the international community. And the second thing was this prisoner exchange thing, which, as you know, depended on 5 Taliban in Guantanamo being exchanged for 1 American prisoner. Now, as far as I can see it very much, the Defense Department has put its foot down on affecting any shift or change in the rules governing Guantanamo. And for 3 or 4 months, the Taliban have been waiting for a response from the Americans on freeing these prisoners. And as you know, there have been various schemes put forward. The Taliban were asking for all 5 to be freed at once. The Americans then offered first 2, a gap of 2 months, and then 3, etc. But none of these seem to be moving forward at all. And now I think they're being caught up in an election cycle. Congress is very much against any kind of release from Guantanamo. The Republicans especially are. The fear is that if Obama was to release somebody tomorrow, there would be, you know, Republicans would jump down his throat. So, in fact, I'm very sadly somebody who has so keenly supported these talks and written about them for a very long time. I see these talks bogged down, certainly until after the elections. And I still don't see how this resolution, internal resolution, inside this administration is going to work out even for the next one. You know, I mean, it's very sad because if you think about it, Guantanamo was the first paper that Obama signed saying, I'm going to do away with it. We're still stuck with Guantanamo. And not only that, but Guantanamo is now holding up the peace process in Afghanistan. Or perceptions of Guantanamo are holding up the peace process in Afghanistan. And I think that is really extremely negative for this administration. You are not going to get movement unless there are serious confidence-building measures. Now, the Americans had agreed to this confidence-building measures 4 or 5 months ago. They had agreed to this prisoner of exchange. Now, you can't go back and make new goalposts and say, well, actually, you know, we didn't mean that. Can we think of something else? Can we have another confidence-building measure? you know. And the Taliban will say, I mean, who are you? I mean, what are you? I mean, are you a superpower or what? You know. So I think there is, you know, there's real hesitancy. And of course, if you try and explain to the Taliban, some of whom I've talked to, and you try and explain, well, look, you know, there's this interagency process in Washington, it's all very complicated, and every department has to talk to every other department, and then the president has to clear it. You know. The interagency department, what the hell are you talking about? I mean, you know, there's a president, he decides what happens. I mean, just like, you know, Mullah Omar decides what happens. But, I mean, so it's difficult, but where I think things could go seriously wrong is if down the road the Americans say, well, this was a bad idea, let's have a new confidence building measure. I think that will destroy trust between the Taliban and the Americans. And it'll be a huge setback to the talks. Not to speak of, you know, the spring offensive and what might happen on the battlefield, etc.
Thank you. I'm going to take two questions at a time. The gentleman here and then Maruf Raza at the back.
Thank you very much. I'm from the Afghan embassy in London. Thank you very much, Mr. Rashid, for the analysis you provided. I fully share your point that the lack of clarity on national security and foreign policy in Pakistan has suffered Afghanistan a lot. You are there and you are witnessing every day that every single attack is carried out in Afghanistan has a link into Pakistan. And our concern is that after the leaving of international forces from Afghanistan, the concern is not just with Afghans, but also in the region, because if the international forces are leaving, and they are leaving in 2014, the end of 2014, no peaceful weeks are passed by in Pakistan and Afghanistan. We see it every day. Could you please give us your analysis? What more the Pakistani government, and in particular the intelligence service and military, can do more to change the situation? Because if you continue like this, it's harmful for both countries. Thank you.
I think we'll take two questions at a time. Yes, Mr. Raza.
Mr. Rashid, my name is Maruf Raza. I'm from India. Two quick points. One is I read that Aisha Siddiqa, who's an author of a very well-regarded book on the Pakistan military, claimed that something between $15 and $20 billion a year is what the military in Pakistan earns from its own economic initiatives like the Fauji Foundation and everything that comes under it. So therefore the question that would American aid to Pakistan in the range of $7.5 billion over 5 years, which translates to about $1.5 billion a year, be good enough to arm twist the military as many of us thought it possibly was? And the second question is for people like you who are intellectuals, middle of the path in terms of moderates. The view is that the moderates, because of this vision of people like Hafiz Saeed and others, have now become the fringe, and what we thought was the fringe has become the mainstream in Pakistan. Your comments, please.
God almighty. Look, on Afghanistan, you know, I've said publicly in Pakistan, I've written publicly in Pakistan that, first of all, let me say, I think that in the recent 1 year or 6 months, relations have improved a lot between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And personally between our leadership, military and political, and your leadership, military and political. And, you know, I just met General Vardak in Washington, and he was saying the same thing. But I think there are two weaknesses in Pakistan's strategy that it has refused to accept or get to grips with. The first is that we are constantly talking about the need for an Afghan-led initiative to talk to the Taliban, etc., but we fail to help the Afghans reach out to those Taliban who are living in Pakistan. In other words, we fail to deliver. We do not deliver on any count, anyone, right? And that really has gone on. It's become a joke now. I think that has gone on too long. And I think there's no point in Pakistani leaders flying to Kabul and saying, you know, we love you, we want to help you, we want to encourage talks, but then at the end of the day, we don't deliver anyone. The Afghans clearly want to talk to the Taliban living in Pakistan. There can be a second track. There's an American track. There can be an Afghan track. We could help that. We need to speed up that process very fast. I think the other thing is, down the line, I think Pakistan has to make itself much clearer to the international community, to the Afghans and to the region, that there will be a limit as to how long Pakistan intends to hold on to the Afghan Taliban, the leadership. In other words, what I'm suggesting here is that perhaps not now, but very soon down the road, if these talks take place, if the Chicago summit comes up with something new, etc., that the Pakistan has to make a commitment that the Afghan Taliban are not going to be resident in Pakistan forever and ever. That there will have to be a timetable for them to go back to Afghanistan under a peace plan, under a peace agreement with Karzai and the government, whoever it is. So what I'm saying is that we need to rebuild confidence. Nobody trusts us right now. Neither the international community, nor the Afghans, nor any of the neighboring countries. Not even China. China is the one, we've had 3 major criticisms from China in the last 3 months. Now, I think to rebuild that confidence in Pakistan, we need to look at the Afghan policy, help the Afghans talk to the Taliban living in Pakistan. Maybe it can be done somewhere else, through Turkey or somewhere else. I mean, it doesn't have to be done, obviously, in Pakistan. And secondly, we ourselves have to give some kind of deadline for these Taliban to go back to Afghanistan under a peaceful settlement. We're not sending them to Guantanamo or sending them into the hands of the Americans or anything like that. But the withdrawal of Western forces, American forces, should be coupled with some return of the Taliban to Afghanistan. So in other words, you would be giving the Taliban a kind of deadline, and you would be giving Karzai a kind of deadline, saying, we're not holding these guys any longer. Now it's up to Afghan to sort it out. You have your talks and all the rest of it, but after 2 years or 3 years, you should be moving out of here. I think that those kinds of indicators should be given to win back the kind of trust that we've lost over the years.
Do you want to ask a question about...
Yeah, sorry. Well, I mean, on USAID, you're talking about the Kerry-Lugar bill, which is giving $1.5 billion to the civil sector a year. USAID just announced yesterday that they've slashed their projects in Pakistan from 140 projects to 35 projects. CEDA, the Canadian Development Authority, has just announced that they have drastically slashed their aid to Pakistan. And it's quite likely that other European countries may follow. Now, that doesn't harbor well for Pakistan. There's a lot of talk about, we should be self-sustained and throw out this foreign money and all the rest of it. But if domestically we don't carry out economic reforms, if we don't raise taxes, if we don't raise revenue, then, how are we going to do, without the income at home and without the income from abroad, how will we cope? So I think, there has to be a little more realism in the minds of the government regarding this foreign aid. Look, I still believe that, the groups like Lashkar and all still constitute a minority. If there are free and fair elections without rigging from the intelligence agencies, the military, the politicians, everyone else, in free and fair elections, these people cannot still muster a substantial vote bank which will give them a larger proportion of seats in parliament. The people of Pakistan are not extremists, and they're not fundamentalists. Yes, I mean, these people are very dangerous. They kill journalists. They have guns. They threaten you. They threaten your families. And it's very difficult. And frankly, there's nobody to protect the moderates that you talk about, because when you turn to the state is occupied with fighting its own wars, etc. So that is certainly a crisis. But I don't think the extremists are in any way a majority in the country.
Brigadier Ben Barry, followed by Vipul.
Is there anything India can do as Pakistan's neighbour to help? For example, you seem to hint that it must avoid any suggestion of meddling in Baluchistan. But is there more that India could do, for example, with trade?
We just got a second question.
Mr. Rashid, you mentioned in the passing about Pakistan's population. In my opinion, Pakistan's exploding population is probably the greatest problem. In 1947, the present geography of Pakistan, I think the population was about 30 million. Now it's 192 million as per latest estimates. By comparison, India's population was 300 million in 47. Now it's under 1,200 million. So India's population has grown by less than 4 times, while Pakistan's population has gone up by about 6.5 times. Now if this continues, in my opinion, any attempts to solve Pakistan's problems, whether internal or external help, will be meaningless. It's like black hole in space. If population goes up like this, whatever you do is useless. So it's up to Pakistan, first and foremost, probably to follow China's one-child policy. Thank you.
Well, you know, I agree with you completely, and I think that it's a hugely pressing issue. But since the first Benazir Bhutto government, we have not had a population planning program in Pakistan. Musharraf didn't consider it important enough. We are one of the only Muslim countries in the world which has no population planning program whatsoever, and no funding for one either. And we don't allow foreigners to come and fund one either. And the population growth rate, which was 3% now, is supposed to come down to 2.2 or something, but nobody believes it because, you know, it's a huge problem. And no government has really shown any, neither Musharraf nor the present government has shown any intention to tackle this problem. All the neighboring countries in South Asia have population programs, including Bangladesh and Iran, and we don't. So I think, you know, obviously it's a huge strain on resources, on food, on water, on, you know, everything else. The question on trade, I think, you know, I think there's been a very encouraging advance that we've seen in the last few weeks and months. To my mind, look, you know, the Pakistan economy is in dire straits. There is absolutely no local investment. Money is leaving the country. Young people are leaving the country. Technocrats are leaving. There's no local or foreign investment right now, and especially the break with the US has led to a break with Europe and all sorts of, you know, other repercussions, including, you know, our relationships with the big lenders like the IMF and the World Bank, etc. So I for long have believed that, you know, Pakistan's, just like at the end of the Cold War, you had the growth of ASEAN, you had the growth of the European Union, and these regional trade pacts. We are the only country and India as well, have failed really to collaborate on trade and investment pipelines, oil and gas from Central Asia, all these things that need to be done. And for the first time, we are seeing now a breakthrough in trade. But the key for a future investment is going to be open investment in Pakistan. You know, are we going to allow Indian investment in Pakistan? Probably not immediately. The army won't allow that. But then, you know, the army better think very quickly, because nobody else is going to invest in Pakistan for the time being. You know, the Indians might, the Iranians might, some of your neighboring countries might. But no, you know, forget about Western investment because of the, you know, massive recession here, and frankly, we have nothing to offer, you know, the West as far as investment is concerned. Even the Arabs are now preoccupied with their own. The Arab investment that took place in the 70s and 80s has dried up. The Arabs are no longer a source of free money for Pakistan. Free oil, free money, free investment, you know, covert money for the intelligence agencies, covert money for the religious fundamentalists. Even the Arabs have dried up. So I think we have to look very closely at, you know, what our interests are. Now, if we could link Indian investment to the transport of oil and gas from Central Asia to India, across Afghanistan and Pakistan, I think that would cause a binding of the two states or the three states together, which would be very productive and very helpful. Now, obviously, I mean, you know, I don't expect Pakistan to start taking immediate steps to encourage Indian investment day after tomorrow. It's going to be a process. But I think, you know, this has to be part of the kind of change and reform that I'm talking about. We have to really be hard-boiled and look at, in the next 10 years, where is investment for Pakistan going to come from? And it's not going to come from the West. Forget it. Europe, America, it's not going to come from there. So where are we going to get investment from? You know, we have to see very closely. And in my opinion, the only countries who are willing to invest in Pakistan, or could be willing to invest, are your neighboring states.
Thank you. Last two questions, Victoria Schofield and Tahir Aziz.
Thank you very much. The follow-up really is actually on the India trade Thank you very much. My follow-up is really on the India trade question with the political relationship with India, because that seems to be crucial for Pakistan's stability, especially also vis-à-vis Afghanistan. And I wondered if you could just elaborate a bit, which of course brings in the vital Kashmir issue. Thank you.
Well, obviously you can't, you know...
Tahir, do you want to quickly ask a question? Okay.
Let me frame it slightly differently. You spoke about the spin-offs from Afghanistan talks into Pakistan. But one could assume that a spin-off of all this strategy could be a better India-Pakistan relationship. But the centrality of that is the Kashmir issue, politically speaking. But you did not elaborate on that. So one could assume that that is the logical extension of your argument. But would you like to make it explicit that that is the case, if you believe in a better relationship, transforming the political situation and making the, holistically speaking, Afghanistan competitive approach, if that transforms, would that make resolution of Kashmir issue possible?
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I mean, I took that for granted, but I mean, there's no question that you cannot have a relationship on trade and investment and take these major decisions without a political process that leads to resolution of your political problems with India. Kashmir, you know, the water issue, Siachen, Sir Creek, all these issues, but primarily Kashmir, of course. You know, you need a political civil leadership which is able to weigh up the benefits of trade, investment, etc., but at the same time be able to push for a settlement of Kashmir. But I think one thing the Pakistani elite military particularly should be aware of, Pakistan is extremely isolated right now. It does not have the support that it had even 1 year ago. You know, and this break with the United States has unfortunately proved extremely damaging, in my opinion. I mean, you know, we can go into the history of this and the killing of the 24 Pakistani soldiers, which was very tragic. But at the same time, the break has really affected the perceptions of Asians, Europeans, Japanese, all the potential, investors. So I think it would be, but it still remains vital that Pakistan retains its desire to settle its political issues. And look, I said this in Washington very openly. I really think it's time that the Americans use some of their India capital that they've built up. The Indians have done absolutely nothing to move forward. Yes, okay, the trade and all these, but these were items that they wanted to move forward 5 years ago. The Indians have done nothing to move forward on building confidence in the South Asian region. Not just with Pakistan, but with all their neighboring states. They've got problems with Bangladesh, Nepal, with Bhutan, with you name it. And forget Pakistan. So, you know, I think the Obama administration dumped India from the AFPAC thing because the Indians raised objections. It was a huge mistake at that time. And it led to enormous mistrust in the Pakistani military vis-a-vis Obama's intentions. Justifiably so. Now I think it's time that, you know, if he enters his second term, it's time and the Americans have got a lot of capital in India. I mean, they've got, you know, goodwill, they've got all sorts of things. It's time they use some of this now to push the Indians into helping Pakistan, and by helping Pakistan resolve these political problems. And also to help, to deal with Pakistan in talking about Afghanistan. And to moderate the two's rivalry that they have in Afghanistan. But I think, you know, critical here is whether the Americans are going to to use the next term, if it's Obama, to actually push the Indians, and they can certainly afford to, in my opinion. They have nothing to lose. And I think the Indians also are aware of the crisis in Pakistan. They also, one horrible sin in Sindh, 40% of Sindhis are suffering from malnutrition right now. There's a real danger of starvation in parts of Sindh. And can you imagine if there's a refugee crisis that leads to Sindhis crossing the border and going to India to look for food? You know, forget Lashkar-e-Taiba and all these groups. I mean, we're talking about a humanitarian crisis of huge proportions in Pakistan, which Pakistan will not be able to cope with. So the Indians should look that a weak, vulnerable Pakistan, beset by natural calamities, insurgencies, etc., is not to their advantage. And I think that awakening, has started in Delhi, but it should take, a form which is, you still have a very strong South Bloc and a very strong perception in the bureaucracy, the military, the Foreign Office in Delhi, which is averse to any kind of change. And I think they need a nudge and a push. And I hope that the next American administration will do that.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Ahmed. This session is over formally, but I'd like to thank you very much for coming here and speaking. There's a lot that you've put across, and I'm sure the discussion could go on further, but thank you very much from all of us.